Okay. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Serge Patard. I am with the Space Domain of University College London. And today it's a new lecture on part of our lecture series, a 1 o'clock lecture series on space. So today we have the privilege to have as a speaker Xavier Pasco from the Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique, who will be talking about the evolving trends in security and defense from and in space. Before Xavier starts, I'd like to say a few words about Xavier. Xavier is the director of the Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique, which is a renowned think tank in Paris, where he is the director of the think tank since October 2016. And prior to that, he has been in charge of space, high technology, and security related studies at the FRS and at the CREST. CREST was the acronym for Center for Research and Evaluation of the Relationships between Strategies in Technology, a research think tank which was associated with the École Polytechnique. Xavier has been in charge of numerous studies and working groups about national and European space policies in the field of civilian and military activities. He has a huge knowledge of the space program in the United States. He has been followed very closely since back to the end of the 90s, since his PhD was about the United States and space. Xavier also was engaged in specific research projects managed by the European Commission in the field of space and security research. He has been in charge of the ESA Commission study related to governance and data policy models suitable for European space situational awareness. He also has supported several analytical works of the Subcommittee on Security and Defense of the European Parliament. I mean, you have been involved in so many studies, so many reports, Pascal, Xavier. It's a bit difficult to read all this and not give you the floor as soon as possible. Let me just recall that you have conducted several projects related to missile defense issues, as well as to the use of space for security, notably the support of national and other international organizations. You are an associate fellow of the Space Policy Institute at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. You have been also, for some time, being on the board of the US Secure World Foundation. And of course, you are a full member of the International Academy of Astronautics since 2012. And you have also published several books. The latest one being, I'll give the title in English, if you don't mind, published in 2017, which was titled The New Space Age, From the Cold War to New Space. It's published in French at the edition of the CNRS. I have to stop here, Xavier. Your CV is absolutely impressive. And who could be more suited today to speak about your topic, which I remind to our audience, which is evolving trends in security and defense from and in space. Xavier, the floor is yours. You have about 40 minutes for the presentation, and the next segment will be devoted to Q&As. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Serge. And thank you, Helen, also. And thank you to University College London for having me talking to you about this trends I will try to present to you. And the goal of this lecture, I would say, for me, would be to provide you with a view of how military space has evolved since the beginnings and where we are today. And more than anything else, I just propose a reading grid, I would say, and an interpretation of how this can be viewed as an evolutionary process. And again, this is something to be discussed and to be challenged in a sense, but I will try to give you some sort of process-oriented kind lecture. So I will now share my screen because I would like to just show you and maybe help you follow my talks. I'm sorry, from the start, I'm not a native English speaker. I will try to be understandable at least. And I hope you can see the screen now.
Xavier, could you put it full screen, please?
I hand the full screen.
No, you don't have full screen now. Can you go just
I
on the
have
right,
full
on the bottom right side on the little camera, and we'll have it full screen.
Okay, on the bottom side. Okay.
On the right bottom side, there is a little screen. Can you click on it? And we will have full screen.
I'm looking at this.
Go to the end, the toolbar at the bottom of the page.
And so it's
on the right side, the
yes.
third icon, you can put it full screen and clicking on it.
Okay, because it's to me it's written in French, of course, and it's control à distance. It's distant control, remote control.
No, there is no text. It's just an icon.
Okay.
I can see it on my screen. On the same line as Français, France, you go to the right-hand side. It's the third icon.
Let me think. Third icon. I must say that I'm not sure I can see it the same way you are.
Oh.
Unfortunately, because I don't have this on my screen on the bottom, on the right hand of the bottom side. So I'm sorry. Maybe what I can do is maybe I can. Okay, so you see, just so I can maybe increase the size.
No. Then go ahead. I mean, if you can't.
So I can do something else. I have another file that I can share maybe, which will be in PDF. I'm sorry for this technical thing, but maybe it's better for you in the PDF aspect. Okay, I will do it very quickly. I guess you can see my screen here. Okay. I need to, I will do the PDF one. Okay. So maybe this one will work. Okay. Okay. Can you see something on screen now?
No.
You don't see? Okay.
But we see the same. So why don't you just start with the initial PowerPoint and we'll go that way then.
Okay. Okay. So maybe you see it now.
No, now it's very poor because we have a half screen.
Half screen. Okay. Okay. And if I do this, maybe it's better.
No, it's for me, it's not better. For me, it's a half a screen. Can you click on the square on the upper right side of your screen? Maybe it's come back to full screen.
Okay.
Xavier, I little bit of a quick advice. If you close that, stop sharing.
Yeah.
Close the application.
I stop sharing.
Up and then open again.
I do it again.
Yeah.
And let me. Okay, and I will try to. I'm sorry for that. Okay, and then I do it again. Okay, and okay, I do this one. So you should be able to see something.
Yeah. Okay, let's go for that one.
Okay. I can do that. So I try to just adjust. All right.
Okay, perfect. Go ahead.
Okay, very good. So first things first, I just wanted to recall ourselves that the driving force behind space policies is really about the strengths of the connection between technological capabilities at a given moment and a political project that gives a meaning a significance to these technological capabilities. And these two things, you know, the state-of-the-art technological status, capabilities, and the political project that gives it a meaning must be strongly connected. And what we see, if we look back to the history of space since the 50s, in that in the civilian domain, this connection is very episodic, is very historically, I would say, short. And you might have, for example, such connections at a given moment for the Apollo missions, for example, because it has some meaning in the political reading of the US at the time, that they needed something to compete with the USSR, but it was very much, of course, limited in times in term of need. And then after Apollo, you had this kind of depressive moment, depressed moment, where you didn't have such a traction, a political traction for space capabilities. And then you had the shuttle, and we could analyze this way. When you look at the military side of the space activity, what you see, and this is very impressive, is an enduring connection. And it explains why, when you look back to the history of military space, you have an ever increasing effort, especially, of course, historically in the two superpowers policies, but also now more widely for the main spacefaring nations. And this is very distinctive between the civilian space, which needs constant advocacy, constant justifications to recreate the connection, and the military space that doesn't really need, that never really needed such advocacies, such justifications, political justifications. So this is why I really want to distinguish between these two sides of the space activities, even if, of course, the two sides are connected to each other, especially through the technological aspect of it. But it's really different. The dynamics is very different. So space as a whole, in my view, is a two-sided activity with very different dynamics. Okay. So if I look at the what have been the space drivers for security and defense, I told you about the connection at a given moment in time between technologies and a political need or a political project. In this particular occurrence, for as far as military space is concerned, space was born from the nuclear era. Space was born, as you all know, after the Second World War, from a very specific event, a very specific encounter, I would say, between two technologies: the technology of the ballistic missiles on the one hand, stemming from the V2s, etc., as you know, and the technology of the nuclear weapon. And if you put this nuclear weapon atop a missile, it would create a completely new armament with a completely new strategic effect. And the fact that this happened, you know, just after the Second World War, created the need to face this new development and to create a situation where you could manage the use, or at least the possession, of such weapons. And you needed to create a situation where you could live, coexist in such a situation. Now, the fact that you had this nuclear ballistic missile era opening up for the next decades has created the need for new technological tools to manage this new era. And one of these technological tools was space. Space was not born from an appetite for going into space. Space was born from an industrial development of space capabilities. It was born from the strategic need to deal with this new, with this revolution, with this strategic revolution. And in particular, if you look at the archive in the US, for example, you will find that there was a fear. The fear was the threat of the missile, of the surprise attack. You know, there was really people were scared by the possibility, by the perspective of a definitive Pearl Harbor, which would be induced by this new weapon. So you had to find something to help you monitor, survey, know better about the status of this new armament on the adverse camp. And this has been the case for the two superpowers at the time, for the two nuclear superpowers, which clearly used space and favored the development of space technologies, not because of its relationship with the missile aspect of it, but because you needed something that would help you monitor what's going on. And in the end, that would help you create this new animal, which was called mutual assured deterrence. And reports at the end of the 40s, beginning of the 50s in the US, pointed out the possibility to send an object with sufficient velocity at a very high altitude, which in a sense would fall indefinitely around the Earth. And then you could equip this platform with cameras, and then you would have, you would end up with a system that would help you monitor what's going on. The point at this time in the 50s was that the aerial surveillance was deemed to be targeted by more and more sophisticated air defense systems. And by the way, the U-2 in the beginning of the 60s was affected by that. And it's precisely at the beginning of the 60s that you end up with these images here. This is the first image taken by a military observation satellite. As you can see, it was a very, we tried to zoom on this. It was a very crude image, you know, but the principle was demonstrated that you could use this as a platform for monitoring adversary capabilities. And by the way, 6 years later, you had this kind of pictures, you know, you have here the airstrip here, you have the airstrip here with the picture that shows how much progress has been immense at this time. So this is what I call the nuclear space or strategic space. And by the way, what I would propose to you is to look at this part of history not as a period, but a bit like a geologist in front of a cliff, you know, as a layer. This is the bottom layer. And by the way, the use of space for managing the nuclear relationship, the strategic environment is still alive. Satellites are used to detect launches, monitor telemetry, observe silos and whatever, you know, this is still active. So this is not, this period has not ended. Of course, it has been very much developed, and I don't have here the shots. I could have shown you shots about launches that have been devoted to strategic systems. It's huge, but it has not ended. So this, please look at the strategic space as a layer, you know, at the bottom of the cliff. Then, so this has, by the way, induced the development of very large military industrial complexes devoted to space. The Lockheeds, the Boeing, the Yuzhnoyes, the Moscow Aviation Institute, all the things have been developed to deal with this very serious dimensions of space. What happened in the 90s, we had a different strategic context appearing at this time with, you know, this cliche about the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, or the things. And what has happened then, and this is especially the case in the US, and this is where the the US have been really leading the pack in a sense and developing these new systems because they had this need. They had the need to adapt to this new strategic situation, the end of the Cold War, keeping in mind that Russia was still equipped with nuclear equipment, but there were other tasks to fulfill. This was a time when the US was at the beginning of the 90s envisioning to fight on two major, what they call two major theater wars, etc. So there was this idea that the US armed forces had to adapt um, to new military missions that they would have to perform in order to keep the world, I would say, um, under control in a sense, military speaking. And the fact that the Cold War had waned created some void, some strategic void, and the US had this obsession at this time, to make sure that this void would not degenerate into uncontrolled regional conflicts, etc. So they reorganized for this. And one of the first occurrence of their involvement in such conflict was the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, which from a space perspective was very enlightening. And in particular, what happened, what appeared was that the equipment developed for what I call the strategic space era from the 50s was not specifically adapted to combat operations. You had very powerful systems able to look into silos, to detect ICBM launches, stuff like that, to intercept some very specific telecommunications. But when you needed space to help the combatant underground and help the combatant fight, you had to target mobile targets. You had to detect short-range ballistic missiles, etc., etc. In this particular field, for example, targeting or detecting ICBMs was made possible because the atmosphere was used as a neutral screen, and you could see the temperature of the flame superposing on the neutral screen. But of course, because the ICBM is leaving the atmosphere. When you're looking at a short-range ballistic missile, it doesn't leave the atmosphere. So the neutral screen is just hiding the temperature and the thermal signature you want to detect. So you had, and in the US, by the way, they had to invent new systems with a very intensive technology investment, new sensors in the infrared domain, for example, and you could multiply this in all the systems, whether it's about visible observation, whether it's about infrared observation, whether it's about telecommunications. You want to connect special forces, for example. So you will want to connect forces with very evasive systems, that cannot be jammed, that cannot be detected. So you will use very large bandwidth, very high frequencies. All this, you didn't really need that for the strategic space. And you will have also to use a new way of doing eavesdropping, etc. So in addition to the investment in the strategic space domain, you had the superposition starting from the 90s, and especially in the US. Now it's widespread in other countries, but at this time in the US, of new investment in what I call the operative or tactical space. Tactical is not the right word because space is not tactical, but I mean, it was space for the warfighter. And this space for the warfighter layer, is just piling over the other one, coming from above. And in a sense, justifying new budget increase in R&D areas that were not developed, that had not been developed for strategic space. This is the time, and you see that on my screen, by the way, here, for example, a good system, a good illustration of what I've just said, space at the service of the combat was the GPS guided munitions. GPS guided munitions is clearly the illustration of how you use space to fulfill operations needs, related needs. And you know how much now GPS guided munitions have taken a large share of artillery and bombings and all this. And so this is the second layer for me. So starting from the 90s up to now. And by the way, the investments have been made in the R&D at this time are paying off today. So what we see, the system we see today have been started in terms of investment, in terms of R&D, research, etc., in the 90s. And very quickly, the geostrategic context kept evolving, and especially in the light of the fight against new threats. And of course, as you know, one of the most dramatic illustration of this was the 9/11 kind of threat. And there was very quickly, it was already in fact started. There was very quickly the notion that if you could use space for in such a flexible way that it could be used for military operation, you could certainly use it for larger security issues and make it even more flexible, making it even more plastic in a sense, and networked. And this is the moment when, starting in the middle of the 90s, and of course been reinforced at the beginning of the 2000s, people begin to think in terms of networks, systems, architectures, systems of systems, etc., etc. And by the way, this is something that's very strong today, and that will also develop another aspect, which is the dual aspect of space. This is the time when space systems have become, I say, agnostic in terms of whether they're used for military or for security or for wider civilian purposes. You know, the point more and more the accent will be put on the technological performance, but it will be put on the technological performance because it makes sense politically, because it answers a specific threat. Okay. So if we have to define this third layer, you know, it's another layer coming from above and piling over the space for combat and strategic space. The main features, it's more and more security and defense oriented, and it's not only military per se anymore. So you go from tactical military use during the conflict to global security use involving operation before and after the conflict, but also domestic security. This is a time when in the US in particular, you see the emergence of this notion of homeland defense, and all this being related, of course, to the 9/11 events. As I said, it's increasingly architecture oriented. And by the way, this is the moment when also space is becoming to be related to other environments. This architecture-oriented vision does not also deal with space architectures, but it puts space in a situation to be connected to other architectures. And we'll see it's very important today. And of course, it's very much dual purpose or dual use more and more, which means that in fact, you can imagine to use in your security-oriented architecture some commercial capabilities in the field of telecommunications or even in the field of Earth observation, for example, because you will want to multiply your systems. And space is seen more and more this time in the 2000s as a key contributor to so-called what we call information dominance as a whole. Information dominance having effects, of course, in the field of military, but also in the field of security issues and others. So I think this is very important, because of course, all this will drive the role and the place of the industry in the 90s and in the 2000s. This is precisely the moment in the US when you see the emergence of commercial capabilities that are being inherited from military development and with administrations and governments, which in fact envision to use this military development in a larger commercial world. You know, one of the key elements was to make sure that what you had developed for very strict military environments, and especially adapted to the nuclear and strategic relationship, could be in a sense reconverted as a more modern power tool that could have some sort of a large array of functions and a large array of possibilities in terms of pulling you and putting all this investment at the forefront of industry, of technological developments, of course, and of I would say of soft power in a sense. So you had at the very moment, and especially in the case of the US in 1994, for example, decision was made to authorize the commercialization of 1 meter resolution imagery from satellites. It's caught everybody by surprise at the time because this kind of resolution was deemed was supposed to be a military resolution, and nobody had this notion that it could become something else. And but the signal was very strong. The signal was we need to develop these things coming out from a very huge R&D investment over the previous decades, and that could transition into larger instruments for controlling, in a sense, and mastering the information chain. The information chain, it's data collection, data transmission, data processing, data dissemination. And of course, and this is one of my ideas here, if you create this new link, this new connection I was mentioning before between space and the information technologies as a way to consolidate your power in the new strategic context, you will like to make sure that these capabilities you have developed in the past will be adapted to the needs, to the political needs you have now in this new strategic landscape. And this is part of it. I can give you another example also in the US in this sense. GPS, the opening of this selective availability, that GPS was limited for the public use to 100 meters at the time, and only the military could access, in the beginning of the 90s, could access to the highest precision. And there was a conscious decision made in 1996, I think, which decided by the Clinton administration at the time, they decided to open the selective availability to make sure that the people who would use the GPS, and would in doing so install the GPS, I would say, as the tool that would remain controlled by the Pentagon. By the way, the GPS, and even today, sometimes the people don't know that, but remain a military program. It's run by the Pentagon. But the point was really to make sure that this program, the GPS program, is all the consequences and the activities it's bringing about, would be based on a US control program, whether it's for precision data, whether it's for timing and datation, for example. And we know how much it's important today with in the context of all these information systems and architectures. So these are examples on how these things have evolved to create some sort of a new power tool in the toolbox in relation to defense and security, but larger than that. Okay, so here you have, for example, the pictures of the first pictures of these new commercial imagery providers in the 90s, and you can see pictures here advertised to show that these new satellites can really show interesting things, even by the way, for intelligence communities. And it was advertised on the internet. So how look at that. In the left bottom square here, the small square you have here. It's I think it's an Mykonos satellite, or maybe a worldview. It's a worldview satellite that has taken a picture of a North Korean missile ascending, with the plume here. So this was for advertisement in a sense, and say, okay, look how much good we are, and we can answer your needs. And so there was, this notion, and today these are the pictures you're all familiar with, and I'm sure, and it's rather impressive. And you see these commercial capabilities advertised, for example, the fact that they can measure the shadow here on the oil tanks, with the floating ceilings, and you can derive from this shadow here the level of oil you have in the reservoir, in the tanks. And then you can, with an algorithm, calculate how much at a given moment in time this or this country can have as a strategic reserve of oil or whatever. So all this, is it's very blurred, between what you need for intelligence purpose, what you will need for commercial competitiveness purpose, etc., etc. And this is precisely what I mean. There is a transition that has been made over the last years due to this connection between space and information technologies. And I think this connection is a political one. It's not only a political one. It's, of course, obviously a technical one. It's a commercial one, etc. It's an industrial one, but it's also a political one. And I think we have to keep this in mind. So space for security is based on the convergence of space and information technologies. It has started 30 years ago. It has developed into a strong defense policy technology connection. And that explains ongoing transformation in space domain. So space is more and more perceived as an infrastructure. And the US, people say a commodity in a sense. From the security defense demand side, it's a central element in the information chain, and in particular for the military communities. This is this ODA loop, the C2 systems, etc. And there is also the interest of having a distributed infrastructure for resilience purpose. It helps you design a system that is much more difficult to attack. Because space has been, of course, perceived as a key vulnerability in the information chain. The fact that you use space more and more in your security architecture, national architecture, makes it a more juicy target for the adverse party. So this is where you have seen from a few years now, for a few years, the emergence of a fourth layer, what I call controlled space, which deals with the security in space. In fact, you rely more and more on the space systems, and so you want to be able to protect them more and more. And this is, to me, a fourth layer that has been added to the other ones that are still existing. And which explains, by the way, why in some countries, and especially in the US, but not only, when you look at the space budgets for the on the military side, it's ever more big. It's skyrocketing. It's never coming back to previous levels. So that's very important, because I think, and this is my interpretation, you need to face these new threats that are added to the other ones, to the pre-existing ones. So you have new stakes in space today, the importance of space situational awareness. We're talking about more and more RPOs, rendezvous and proximity operations, and we're talking more and more about space traffic management. And by the way, and thank you, Serge. Yes, we FRS, we've been coordinating an EC Horizon 2020 project that's called Spaceways, and the goal is really to produce recommendations for the EU in this particular case for STM, future STM norms. And it's interesting to see how much, you know, these words are really at the intersections of different communities in a sense. So control space, it's a new layer on top of the others. Uh, there's been space control doctrines that have been produced already, starting from September 2004, for example, in the US. It's a very interesting, the Counter Space Operation Air Force Doctrine document is a very interesting document to read in this particular case. And we have witnessed a number of ASAT anti-satellite tests that have been performed, starting, okay, historically it's been performed by the USSR and the United States during the Cold War, but in the new times, there has been a resumption of this test by China in 2007, and there's been a number of similar tests, and the last has been this ASAT test in last November by Russia, and India also did its own test in March 2019, I think. So it's interesting to see that, and on the diplomatic side, it has brought about the resumption of talks and I would say confrontations, showdowns between the diplomatic communities on the one hand, Russian and Chinese on the other hand, and the US and I would say the European also, opposing each other in terms of what would be the right instrument to address these new security challenges. Treaty for the Russian and Chinese, maybe code of conduct or some international regimes, I would say, for the US and the EU. Today, it's still discussed. It's very difficult, and what we can say that the situation remains rather tense. So, do we know there are new international political and legal era? This is what we'll see. We see that we have to deal with threats, of course, but we have also to deal with risks. More and more debris, more and more objects in space. We're talking about mega constellations with dozens or even hundreds of thousands of objects that will move more and more because the technology has evolved, because of the electric propulsion and all this. So we will need to have a collective transparency that's up to the requirements created by these new objects. This is really a challenge, but there's one thing we know, that we're all interdependent in space. And so we don't want one of the space community member, you know, acting in a very wrong way and behaving in a wrong way that would affect anybody, including itself, by the way. So we're in the middle of this. And very quickly, because I think my time is up, but I really wanted to focus on this info space connection, I would say, because I think, in my view, it is by now one of the main drivers of space activity as a whole, and in particular in the field of military uses of space. And it's interesting to see that we have this many startups that have started in the 2000s. In fact, they have appeared in the US in a very favorable terrain that had been prepared 10 years before by this commercialization I was talking about. And then you had this, the seeds had been planted before, and they had grown up and they have ended up with these space startups. But the interesting thing that beyond the startups themselves that put satellites in space, you have these newcomers coming from the information world, you know, which want to plug on the data fluxes and the data flows and create information. And this is also very important. In my view, this is a very, very strong driver today, which is the relationship between the space activity itself and the space manufacturing industry and space operators on the one hand, and these information operators on the other hand. And these two things go together and create some sort of new activity by creating added value. And this is by the way, this is a bit of a challenge. We know it has to be demonstrated that it's creating added value. It's not completely sure yet, you know, there must be some sort of experiments that sometimes don't work, but still we see that we have this very, very heavy trend. And we have this in China. We see the structure of you know, satellite manufacturing and downstream sector. You have this, in a sense, in Europe. This is a very old graph, but you might have one similar graph updated today with you know, more and more new space enterprise industries and also but new actors, new downstream actors. And I would say that we more and more we're heading towards the notion of defense and security space infrastructure commodity, which is multi-users, multi-functions, multi-financed. And this is interesting because one of the challenges is the relationship between state and private actors. You know, certainly space was one of the most regalian state-regulated activity, and it still is. I mean, most of the money circulating in the space industry is public money, and don't mistake about that. But we have these new actors coming from outside of the space community, coming from the information world with a lot of resources, starting to invest in space because they find it's efficient for them. And one of the challenge, whether it's in the US, whether it's in China, whether it's in Europe, everywhere, is to recreate the good relationship between state and this private side, which is it's not easy, by the way. But from a technological perspective, space infrastructure and an indistinct architecture of systems which makes nodes, whether it's space, aerial, terrestrial, and downstream activities, critical for success. And so we see the emergence of all these activities, I would say, aggregating around space activity. And this is very, very new. This is the 21st thing. So I think I will stop here. I just want to give you some ideas about that. You know, you see this small space startups, you know, trying to put sensors in space basically, and feed customers, whatever they are. And mostly these customers right now, up to now, are governmental customers. It's okay, 360 or in Synlab in France, you will have these kind of things. And the interesting thing, that's very much information oriented. And even a big firm that we all know very well, SpaceX, has been eager to partner, for example, with Microsoft Azure, you know, this very large cloud player, the second one behind Amazon, to win the contract for the Pentagon, which was the JEDI contract, which was the Pentagon cloud program for 10 years. You know, it was 10 billion for 10 years. They won it, and finally the contract was canceled once Joe Biden was elected because Jeff Bezos, who competed for the program with Amazon, wanted to have its part in it. But the principle remains the same. You know, what you see basically today is this. You have here the space activity, and especially in the field of security, structured around three required pillars. One is a good space industry, you know, low cost, good, efficient, whether it's for launchers, whether it's for satellite productions, etc. It exists in these countries. The second one is that you have to have a good, powerful value-adding downstream sector. This is very important because this is what creates the value, and that this is what I would say justify the fact that you're investing in space. But you also have to have a very large public player, which will start the system by investing in very large public programs that will help these other actors here set up their future business and their future business plan. And if you have this, so they start the pump, I would say, and basically it's a 10 billion, the unit is really 10 billion of a 10-year contract. We see that in China, by the way. China wants to launch its some constellations. It has a large community of very key major industrial players in the field of internet and cloud, and they have a very large government with a very large needs and a very large purchase power that could start this. So I would say the point for Europe and for all the European countries is to maybe have this kind of greed and wonder about its ability to recreate these kind of things, or maybe use some other ways and avenues to create this. So I thank you here. I'm sorry, I think I went a bit longer, but I hope it has helped you to see my point. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Xavier. You overpassed a little bit your time, but you started late, so I mean, it's fair enough. Thanks a lot for this presentation. We shows the diversification of actors, the complexification of the field indeed, and I think it's going to continue. So I believe we have still 10 minutes for questions. The floor is open for questions. Just to grab your mic and ask Xavier a question if you have some. Go ahead.
What do you think are the possibilities of a war in space?
Yeah.
Please give a short answer, Xavier.
So the possibility of a war in space. Yeah. Up to now, I think all the players have been realistic enough to consider that a war in space would be a catastrophe for everybody and would not help developing space activity, would not help developing these new trends I mentioned, would not help your national security. You know, there's one thing that is being very, very specific to space. From the government, they realize that for the best of their national security, they must bet on collective security. This is the only place where you could say so. It's not the case at sea. It's not the case for ground and territorial things. It's not the case in the air. It's the case in space. So that's the reason why we still have these discussions about transparency, about how to make sure that you don't have misunderstandings, how to make sure that you can attribute things, etc. It's just because you know that everybody will lose if something erupts and get out of control. So I'm rather optimistic, and it doesn't mean that nothing happens in space, by the way. But I really believe that if we have a space war, it will be war larger than in other places like that, than in space only.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Another question. No other questions. Well, I have one for the moment, Xavier. It's almost striking to see the difference of reactivity between the European community at large, public and private, on the one hand, and I mean the American communities and the European communities. I mean, the Americans can adapt very quickly. They're extremely innovative, and the lead time which is taken in the US to develop a particular equipment, set, services is much shorter usually than the European ones. So I don't want to talk about the Chinese because I know nothing about the Chinese and think it's difficult to have accurate information coming from China on these grounds. But do you have a rationale that explains this difference of reactivity in setting up new services, new equipments, new ideas, and new innovations between the US and Europe?
Well, Serge, as you know, of course, and this is the issue with the EU. We are 27 member states now. We used to be 28. We're 27, and take my example of the Azure Starlink partnership for answering a Pentagon defense need. Okay, you had a Pentagon program called Joint Enterprise Defense Initiative for the military cloud, with an injection of public money of 10 billions over 10 years. Okay, and then it was some sort of there was a call for offer, and so Starlink partnered with Azure to buy, I would say, the customership of Azure, and Azure bought some connectivity by partnering with Starlink. There was some sort of a win-win situation for both of them, creating the industrial tool to answer the Pentagon need. Okay, if you look at Europe on these kind of things, you know that we're talking about connectivity, secure connectivity. We have this project of having a constellation for telecommunications there. Okay, if you take my grid, I would say, you will have to justify in front of 27 states that don't have the same space industry, the same, I would say, objectives in terms of political objectives, strategic objectives, military objectives. We don't have a common defense policy. All these things are really objective difficulties for raising sufficient political support for such a program, because you will have to I would say create a story for explaining all these states that this tool is very much needed. It could be needed for SCAF, it could be needed for a lot of military purpose. By the way, some European member states are acting militarily outside of Europe, such as France, but not only, etc. But some countries don't, you know. So you have to have this. So you always have an institutional handicap, I would say, in making quick decisions. On the other side, once it's engaged, and look at Galileo, look at Copernicus, etc., this is something you usually would, it would be hard to stop it, because, you know, things are getting momentum. So I think we have to realize that, and the trouble is that space was okay, because, you know, it used to take 15 years to develop a satellite. Now the problem is that the cycles, the technological cycles, are much shorter, and so they would require much more reactive political decisions. And then this is where you have a new difficulty. But this is what I can answer to you. And the fact that, as you know, as you very well know, and in the United Kingdom, it's something that's very well known. The defense policy is not managed at the EU level; it's managed at the member states level. It's something that is linked to the national sovereignty. And so, as I showed you in my presentation, as the military activity is a very strong driver for space activity, of course, at the EU level, this is a handicap, because you don't have a military activity per se. So this is changing. You know, you have the defense, your European Defense Fund. You have a number of initiatives that create more, I would say, familiarity with security domain, with the defense domain, but it will remain very long in terms of and very slow in terms of progression, in my view.
Yeah, if I continue your explanation, thank you for the explanation. You just pointed out the difference in speed. So even if there is a certain increasing consciousness of the way the Europeans have to be put more together to compete and to achieve some goals we need for our defense and security, of course, the Americans are not going to stay put. They're going to continue. And the rate of the US, for instance, and probably the rate of China, will be much faster than Europeans. So I would say, a bit pessimistic view of the future is that maybe the only thing really was going to happen is that the gap will widen between the Europe and the US instead of narrowing down. Am I right?
That's possible. Still, Serge, I think that, okay, at its own pace, Europe is on the right track, because I think there's a new awareness of what you just said. And that this is something, because it has consequences much larger than only on military aspects, you know, it has consequences on the industry, on the competitiveness, on everything. I think people are getting more and more aware. And it's getting easier and easier to tell a story, I would say, to create the conditions where you could have legitimate political decisions made, you know, at the level of the EU. But of course, all this must be are relative in terms of speed. I agree with you, but I see the glass half full, and you see it half empty.
So maybe we should drink it.
Yeah, maybe.
Okay, thanks a lot, Xavier, for your answer. Are there any other questions?
I would like to follow up.
Yes, last question.
Yeah, very quick one, and a bit of a follow up. So, because it sounds still like I think there is awareness from industry that we are being slightly kind of behind the other countries and other regions, and I'm not sure there is the same level of awareness at the political level. Or in terms of increasing that speed, because so just perhaps what else can we do to not to allow that gap to widen that much? Because I think I'd like to hear a little bit of an optimistic message that there is something that we can practically do to not to allow this gap to widen that much.
Yes, I agree fully with your view. Certainly, the industry is much more, I would say, aware of this than the political. Because, you know, from a political perspective, you know, space is somewhere here, but you don't win elections with space only, you know. So anyway, you just look at it from a distance, I would say. Still, I think because of what happened with Elon Musk, I think because with what happened with the moon program and all the things, you know, revolving around this transformation in space, and with what happened with the increasing weight taken by the space systems in your own security and the security of the citizen. Now the political awareness has been raised that it could be, you can have a political discourse on it. And then you can, I would present yourself, and even at the European level, as a promoter of a space policy, of an ambitious space policy, whether it's in the exploration domain, human exploration, whatever, launchers, satellites, networks, etc. I think because the industry pushed a lot also, I think it's getting more and more, the political person is getting more and more familiar with the things. But you're right, this is really the point. I think at the EU level, at the Commission level, maybe you followed Thierry Breton, this commissioner. You know, he did a number of speech about space and some other things. And of course, all the people don't agree on that, on what should be done. But I mean, this is rather new. We didn't have that before, really. We had, and by the way, Europe did very good systems for monitoring the Earth environment and all the things. And I think we should keep this, by the way, very strongly. I think Europe is the guardian angel of the Earth in a sense. But we need to do more than that. But we need to justify, and we need to tell a story. I would say we need to take people by hand and say, okay, it's good for you. It will be good for your children, and it needs at least, and it will be my last word, Serge. It needs to be publicly debated. And this is, I think, the most important thing that we have to do right now. Open the public debate.
Thank you, Xavier. I agree with your last sentence, indeed, of course. Well, I think we have to bring it to a close now. Yeah, we are beyond the hour. I want to thank you again very much for your presentation. There was a lot of material in it. We have to, of course, look at it more carefully. I want to thank also the participants for their questions and their attendance. And just to inform that our next lecture, our next 1 o'clock will be scheduled for March the 1st, and it will be on telecommunications and distant telecommunication in space, very distant communication in space. Again, many thanks, Xavier, and many thanks to all of you. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Alan, I believe you will stop recording.